Hello everyone, I'm Carrie, or J Night Sews. Welcome to my channel. Is this gown problematic? Chemise gowns, or chemises à la reine as they are often called, were a trend on Instagram in the late spring, early summer in the historical costuming community. Since hot weather was approaching and I'd had this laughing moon pattern for a few years now, I decided to turn my IKEA Matilda curtains into a lightweight summer chemise gown. This video is about the early history and possible origins of the gown, as well as how I made mine, and how to pursue historical costuming as a more environmentally and socially conscious sewer. I assumed, like many, that the chemise gown originated with Marie Antoinette and her desire for a pastoral, shepherdess, or what we might think of today as cottagecore aesthetic, and Elizabeth Louise Lebrun's scandalous 1783 portrait of her in the informal dress that looks like 18th century underwear, or a chemise. My friend Christine, or Sostine, has an excellent video out on her version of this Marie Antoinette dress and connection with the chemise à la reine, and I'll link that in the description below. It's important for all historical costumers to think about and research the cultural context of the costumes they make. So my contribution will be to go to a bit further back than the French Queen to look at the colonial origins of this style of gown and how it ended up in Europe. The gaulle, from the Creole word gaulle, was an informal fine white cotton dress worn by the wives of the richer white men in the French West Indies, who most often owned plantations and enslaved people. Creole here means white people born in the colonies, and this style has often been attributed to them. Gaulle is defined by Jane Ashelford as, quote, a single-piece garment made from a fine cotton like percale and placed over the head of the wearer with only a flexible cloth bodice serving as an undergarment. It was cut so the fullness of the fabric could be controlled and defined in two areas, the low oval neckline and the waist, unquote. The bright white and lightweight cottons from which these gowns were made visually represented the wealth and status of their wearers and were much more suitable to the tropical climate than more traditional French silk in the Caribbean. I mean, I totally get that. I wanted to make one because I'd prefer to wear such a garment rather than my super fancy silk robe à la française, at least during the summer, to costuming events. And I always think of that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where Elizabeth faints and falls. I know it is supposed to be because her stays are way too tight to fit into that gown, even though they should be a little bit adjustable, but it could also be because she's dressed in impermeable silk in the tropics. Okay, but where did the richer white people get the idea to wear these white, lighter fabrics in looser, more comfortable styles that were eventually imitated and refashioned by the middle-class whites in the colonies, and eventually the Queen of France and much of Europe? Who else was living in the tropics with these French colonists? The population of Saint-Domingue, the richest French West Indian colony that is now Haiti, was over 85% enslaved black people in the 1770s and 80s. 85%. This equated to then 500,000 enslaved people, 500,000. Another 5% were free black and mixed race people. I have not been able to find any scholarly sources that come right out and say the white colonists appropriated loose white gowns from the enslaved and free people of color. But let's look at some scant and possibly circumstantial evidence, and you let me know in the comments what you think. Of course, I'll share what I think. Before chemise-style gowns became popular among white colonists, elite women in the French West Indies were depicted in traditional silk gowns in portraits. But look who else is in this portrait of Marguerite something or other, the wife of a slave trader from 1753. Her servant, possibly an enslaved woman, is wearing a bright white gown that looks a bit loose compared to Marguerite's and resembles the chemise it covers. Enslaved people were given linen and cotton either to make clothing or already in the form of clothing, and it makes sense they would use lighter colored, unrestricted garments to do their forced labor in a taxing tropical climate. In this portrait by Agostino Brunius called Creole Woman and Her Servants, painted sometime in the 1770s, we can see colorism on display. The Creole, or white woman, wears fine, bright white clothing, while the woman of mixed race wears pretty but less white clothes, resembling European styles, and the woman with darker skin is in the background, shadowed, and her clothes are a dingy gray, but were presumably white to begin with. The mixed race woman, possibly a free woman, is sitting like her employer and appears almost like a friend and equal, while the woman in the background is standing and serving, denoting her less free status, again possibly as an enslaved person. But notice the similarity in dress and headdress, especially if you squint and ignore color. This painting illustrates clothing as evidence of the social hierarchy in the colonies, a hierarchy that was directly correlated to skin color, but how easily that hierarchy, in terms of the clothing, could be challenged by free women of color. Also by Brunius, this painting, called Linen Day, depicts a variety of people at a fabric market. The word linens refer to cloth made of both linen and cotton. It's clear in the painting which woman occupies the highest rung on the social ladder. She wears the whitest clothes, sports the most ruffles in her chemise gown, is attended by at least one servant holding a parasol, and looks to be shopping rather than selling or working. But the gowns of many of the black women in the painting come close in color and some in style. In this mid-1780s painting of Madame Relied, a Creole plantation owner, we see her gown closely resembles more structured varieties of chemise gowns and is all white with a colored sash, while the enslaved person on the left is scantily clad in bright colors, and the free woman of color on the right is also in bright clothing that resembles earlier European styles. There is a clear cross-pollination of clothing fashions, nowhere more evident in this painting at least than the women's headdresses. The first women known to wear gaulles in France were the daughters of a very wealthy merchant in the port town of Bordeaux. Francois Bonaf owned 30 ships that traded with Saint-Domingue, and his daughters could have afforded the finest French silks, but instead preferred to wear these relatively simple and definitely more comfortable white cotton gowns. The first French fashion plate to reference a West Indian style appeared in Galerie des Modes in 1779, the caption of which described it as a vêtement à la Creole, or similar to those worn by our French ladies in the Americas. Here, the Americas would be not only North America, but also the Caribbean islands. You can see the looser fit, lighter fabric, and use of a sash, but it doesn't quite fit the definition of a gaulle, and I think there may have been some conflation as the fashion evolved, which it did so very quickly. Also in 1779, a ballet set in the French West Indian colonies and viewed by the king and queen in Paris featured many ballerinas in white muslin costumes a la Creole. The queen admired the simplicity and comfort of the style, and by 1782 had several in myriad colors and even stripes. And then, of course, Le Brun's painting of her in 1783 created a firestorm of criticism, not least because the queen's use of imported cotton was seen as a threat to the French silk industry, and she was later blamed for the loss of 3/4 of the jobs in silk. This echoes similar sentiments earlier in the 18th century from wool weaver guilds in England, where cottons imported from India were so controversial and threatening to business, the guilds organized attacks on women caught wearing printed cotton gowns, even those made and printed in England. Many women not only had the clothes ripped off their bodies, but suffered much worse at the hands of these mobs, all for wearing cotton. These attacks, both on English women and the French queen, were essentially attacks on women's clothing choices to uphold white, male patriarchal institutions, i.e. the weaver guilds and the monarchy. Ironically, white and relatively loose gowns would become all the rage among French revolutionaries and eventually much of early 19th century Europe. Chemise gowns were even worn by members of the Blue Stocking Society in England, including Mary Wollstonecraft. So the robe à la Creole, or the gaulle, appears to have been an appropriation and refashioning of the somewhat loose and white gowns worn by enslaved and free women of color in the French West Indies. And this fashion eventually made its way back to Europe and morphed into the chemise à la reine and its many iterations, including those worn by more forward-thinking members of English society, like the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I learned all of this after I completed my own chemise gown, except for the neck ruffles ruffles and accessories, and after I broke my left arm on June 15th. I couldn't sew for a while, but thankfully I could still do this research. It certainly made me ask myself, is this style of gown problematic? Is wearing a gown like this problematic? I think the answer to both those questions depends on the context in which the gowns are worn. I think chemise gowns are relatively easy and accessible for new sewists, and we shouldn't take them off the table as possible project because of their history, as long as we acknowledge that history. I think they are appropriate in certain contexts, including the following. So if you make your own gown or pay someone else very well to make one for you, and you provide appropriate historical context or provide links to such in social media content about your project. For example, see Noodle Stitch's posts about their black chemise gown on Instagram. Historical costuming is, in general, more equitable and diverse than the original time periods of these gowns. There's still gatekeeping and privilege, but any sewist, regardless of race or gender, who can afford $20 worth of material and the time can make a chemise gown, and I'm in at least 2 inclusive historical costuming groups that welcome them at events. Hopefully by now it goes without saying that unless you work there as a historical interpreter, don't wear a gaulle or a robe a la Creole anywhere in the former Caribbean colonies or any former plantation in the Americas. History bound instead of going full-on historically accurate. Put your own spin on your chemise gown. For example, I ditched the 18th century wig at the Missouri History Museum last month during an event with the St. Louis Historical Sewing Society. I could also wear my chemise gown with modern accessories and scamper about barefoot in the grass or in my garden. Cottagecore. Or I could use very modern fabrics or techniques like Morgan Donner's tie-dyed chemise gown. I'm thinking of making one with a magenta colored fabric with even more ruffles. Like, how many ruffles can I attach to this dress? In public places like museums, make sure you ask permission before wearing a costume that might distract other visitors or make them think you work there. But do use the opportunity to educate the curious on social media and in your costuming groups about the complex history of this style. It's important we acknowledge that many European and American fashions are complicated and problematic at some point in their histories, whether it be the materials, construction, or style, possibly because of who wore them, and all of this is usually because of the exploitation and cultural appropriation that were involved. As anti-racist historical costumers, we have to continue to learn about the historical context of the clothing we make and question the status quo of understanding in our community. If my hypothesis is correct that the clothing of the enslaved and free people of color in the French colonies inspired later chemise gowns, then it is important that I acknowledge this connection. I chose my Laughing Moon pattern size based on my waist and bust measurements in my 18th century stays from Red Threaded, and made a mock-up of the lining because I wanted a fitted back rather than gathered, so I needed a fitted foundation, and that is not what I got. So I had to do a bit of adjusting, including taking in the side back seams and adding a side piece. Mock-up number 2 fit much better, and I used up the last scraps of this blue IKEA duvet cover, which I used to make a Regency morning gown last year. Seemed appropriate on multiple levels. I thought I'd try the fitted sleeve, but eventually decided on the more billowy one because ruffles. Here I'm measuring the skirt length I wanted, but you can't really tell because my waist is out of the frame, sorry about that. I ended up taking one whole curtain, removing the loop tab thingies at the top, re-hemming it, and then cutting it in half across the width to create 2 back skirt panels, which I seamed together by machine and then gathered at the top using a stitch length of 5. This gave me a very full skirt that reaches right above my ankles. I reserved about 2/3 of the length of the other curtain for the front skirt and the bodice portion of the gown, and used the remaining third for the bodice back, the sleeves, the shoulder straps, the sleeve bands, and ruffles, and 2 neck ruffles. All told, the curtains provide 5.4 yards of 55-inch wide fabric. That works out to less than $4 per yard. I cut the bodice back lining as 2 pieces with seam allowance in the middle so I could press and stitch down the seam allowance on both sides and create channels for boning in case I needed it to help the bodice back fit better. I used an awl and buttonhole stitch to create holes at the top for zip ties that I did not end up using because the bodice back fits great. I then took a large rectangle of the curtains and placed it on the back lining, pleating the curtain fabric and pinning it as I went while attempting to pattern match. The pleats are not very dramatic, but I like them. I then cut away the excess curtain and top stitched the pleats to the lining. I used my sewing machine to sew the bodice lining pieces together, carefully trimmed down the seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch, and then folded over the edges of the bodice fashion fabric pieces to fit over the lining and top stitch them down by hand. This is one of my favorite 18th century construction techniques that I think looks much nicer than bag lining. As you can see, Susan was happy to help. I then turned under the bottom of the bodice and hem stitched, as usual using too much thread at once, resulting in tangles. I then stitched the bodice back and sides to the skirt back panels using a slip stitch. I machine sewed the remaining curtain to the back skirt panels and kept the original finished edges, so I did not have to mess with finishing the hems. Yay! This is the nice thing about using curtains, but you can also use the selvage edges of fabric. Here is the gown inside out, folded at the center front. I cut the front panel as a very stretched out version of the bodice front lining. Here I am using a gathering stitch along the top of the shoulders on that front panel. To create a drawstring casing along the neckline at the front, I took the strip I had removed that had overlain the curtain loop thingies, cut it down to about 1.5 inches wide, and sewed it to the top, right sides together, pressed the raw edge under, rolled it to the inside, and slip stitched it down before running a very narrow cotton tape through from both ends. Again, I used an awl and buttonhole stitch to make durable openings for the drawstrings. I did the same thing for waistline and underbust drawstrings, and although this fabric has a pattern, it is not even, just to warn you. So I had to measure an eyeball to get these in the right spots, and I was not completely successful. I used water to help with making a tiny rolled hem like for the sleeve ruffles. I roll lip gathered the top of the ruffles before attaching them to the bottom of the sleeves along the bands. Here I am stitching on the shoulder straps. Susan loved hanging out under the somewhat uneven hem. How the heck did that even happen when I measured up to the waistline drawstring? Ugh. But the gown was almost done and wearable. However, this is when I broke my arm, tripping over a cat on the basement stairs. So making the neckline ruffles did not begin until early July, but I think it helped keep my left hand limber because my physical therapist says I'm ahead of schedule on getting back to 100% mobility and strength. I whip stitched the 2 ruffles and then carefully whip stitched them to the neckline, straight along the front so they would gather along with the bodice neckline, and after roll whip gathering along the back. I used 2 strips of the width of the curtain for each ruffle. Then it was time for accessories, and I used this image as inspiration. I made a pink sash from striped silk Christine gave me earlier this year in a care package. I thought I would pink the edges, but that didn't even start out well, so I just cut strips, sewed them together, turned them inside out, and pressed. Voila! My sash is super long, so I can make a big bow at the back. I refused to buy new supplies for a while due to my medical and other expenses, so the lining for my 1780s hat is a poly blend knit. Shh, don't tell anyone. I traced the hat on the fabric, cut it out, then ironed it, and I know I should have ironed first, but oh well. I thought I would just cover the top in the green poly satin, but afterwards decided it wasn't dramatic enough and ripped out the stitches. I know using a glue gun would take much less time, but that is relatively irreversible, and I'm a wishy-washy Pisces who changes her mind a lot. I made a puffy Granada style hat instead based on the tutorial on Instagram that I'll link below. I recently went to a tea party in this ensemble with my American Duchess ivory Kensington shoes, silk stockings, Dames a la mode pink earrings, and the 1780s sorta hedgehog wig I made last summer. It was so lovely seeing friends in the St. Louis group, and the tea was delicious but very hot, so I ditched the wig before we went to the Missouri History Museum to see the Beyond the Ballot exhibit on women's suffrage. I only brought one hat pin, which was not enough. I think I needed at least 6 pins to keep this monster on my head. I love this gown even though I need to fix the hem and the shoulder areas in front. It is light and airy and relatively comfortable in the miserable Midwest apex of summer. I'm glad I made it because the making motivated me to research the problematic origins and iterations along with more positive aspects of its history and share those with you. If I hadn't made one, I'd have been content to go no deeper. Making and researching chemise gowns has also made me more aware of cotton in the history of the Industrial Revolution, slavery, colonialism, and the origins of capitalism, and how all of these tied together continue today to make some people wealthy in the world of fast fashion, while subjugating many others in forced or low-wage labor and strapping them with the environmental consequences of going from cotton seeds to clothing in our closets or curtains in our windows. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to continue on this historical fashion journey with me, please subscribe to my channel or donate to my Ko-fi account. This video is part of the Costube Symposium, a free YouTube event put on by members of the Costube community. Check out the links in the description box below for the full schedule and playlist. Thanks. Bye.